Publisher Chip Goodman had just walked out of the room. Senior editor Jeff Rovin responded by putting a T-square through the office drywall. It was the end to another brutal argument. Rovin decided it was time to quit. But first, he was going to commit one last act of defiance against his employer. This act was going to involve one of the sore subjects between the two, a superhero called the Grim Ghost. First, the backstory. Chip Goodman had been an editor at Marvel Comics. His father, Martin, had started Marvel Comics back in the 1930s. Chip grew up around his father's company. He had been brought in at an early age and taught the publishing game. Chip was the crown prince of Marvel Comics, but before the crown could be placed on his head, fate stepped in. Martin Goodman sold the company, and Chip would never get a chance to sit on the throne. Both buyer and seller had conditions for the sale to go through. Perfect Film and Chemical, who later changed their name to Cadence Industries, demanded that editor-in-chief Stan Lee sign a 5-year contract. They felt that Marvel's future success centered around him. Martin Goodman agreed to the sale only if he could remain on as publisher until his retirement, which was still a few years down the road. All parties agreed, and the sale of Marvel Comics went through for roughly $15 million in cash and stocks. Everything was fine until Martin announced his retirement. The Goodman family was under the impression that Chip would step into his father's role as publisher. That didn't happen. Cadence Industries promoted Stan Lee to the newly lofted position of president and publisher of Marvel Comics Group. The Goodman family was furious. Chip was out at Marvel. The Goodman family was angry, and they wanted to hurt Marvel. They wanted revenge, and that revenge would take the form of Atlas Seaboard Publishing. And now, on to our main story. Jeff Rovin answered a want ad for a comic book editor in the New York Times. He met with Martin and Chip Goodman for lunch and blew them away with his energy and ideas. Rovin had gotten his start in comics as a teenager. He got his foot in the door at Skywald Comics in the 1960s. While doing a high school term paper on comics, he visited Skywald for research. Former Marvel production manager Saul Brodsky was the editor at Skywald. He let Rovin interview him, and he was so impressed with the kid that he offered him an internship. After that, he was hired as an assistant editor at DC Comics. Rovin worked at DC Comics for a couple of years before moving on to the managerial staff at Warren Publishing. In addition to his managerial duties, he also doubled as a writer. Rovin was only in his mid-20s and already had years of experience. Rovin was hired along with former Marvel editor-writer-artist Larry Lieber to be co-editors-in-chief. The goal of the Goodmans was to hurt Marvel. One thing they wanted to do was raid Marvel's bullpen for talent, but Rovin's connections in the industry were with Warren and DC, and he began hiring talent from those companies. The Goodmans blindly hated anyone he brought in. This became the first of many disagreements to come. One person Rovin targeted at DC was writer Michael Fleisher. Rovin admired Fleischer's run on the Spectre in Adventure Comics. This Spectre run, although incredibly well written, had put Fleischer in hot water with DC editorial. Fleischer's stories had an occult theme which was not banned but frowned upon by the Comics Code Authority. It also contained a level of violence that was right on the edge of what the CCA would approve. Fleischer would be teamed up with another non-Marvel talent, artist Ernie Colon. Born in Puerto Rico, Colon had moved to New York City as a teenager. Shortly after arriving in New York, he began drawing comics and was employed a number of years at Harvey Comics, where he drew Richie Rich and Casper the Friendly Ghost. He had also drawn several issues of Dr. Solar for Gold Key. Rovin had never met Colon, but knew him by reputation. Over the phone, Rovin asked Colon what his rate was. Colon told him the greatly inflated rate of $65 a page. Colon was shocked to hear Rovin say, "You're way too good for that," and offered him $105 a page. The book they teamed up for was The Grim Ghost. Rovin gave the two a free hand to be as creative as they wanted. For the script, Fleisher went with a supernatural theme and violent action, and for the art, Colon, instead of using heavy ink brush lines which most supernatural books used at the time, decided to use a crow quill pen instead to ink the story. This type of pen created a very fine line which gave the Grim Ghost its own very unique feel and look. The tale of the Grim Ghost begins in modern times at the scene of a warehouse robbery. An elderly night security guard is brutally murdered. The robbers are about to make their getaway when a phantom appears out of the night sky. The Grim Ghost lands before them and introduces himself. Next, the readers get a brief glimpse of how the Grim Ghost deals with evil souls. After this brief vignette, we get to learn the secret origin of the Grim Ghost. The reader is taken back in time to colonial America, where a man named Matthew Dunsinane is a wealthy landowner. But at night, he puts on a black mask and lurks the highways as a bandit called the Grim Ghost. As both Matthew and the Grim Ghost, he gets involved with the attractive wife of a local magistrate. He is beguiled by her beauty, but her teasing is a trap. The Grim Ghost is captured. He is tried and hanged. Matthew discovers that hell is real. The Lord of Hell welcomes Matthew, but oddly enough, Satan does not want to punish him. No. Satan likes his style and wants to send him back to the world of the living to bring back more souls for his minions to feast on. Matthew agrees and is sent back, but instead of being sent to his own time period, he finds himself 200 years into the future. Matthew discovers that Satan has set him up in his old house and has given him a flying demonic horse. And now, the Grim Ghost sets out across the night looking for evil souls to send to hell. The Grim Ghost was one of the first books by Atlas to hit the comic racks. It didn't look or read like any Marvel book. This infuriated the Goodmans because they specifically told Rovin to copy what Marvel was doing. As Martin Goodman had repeatedly told him over and over, Marvels sell. Rovin, however, had a different opinion. He felt that if Atlas was to be successful, they had to create their own look and build their readership by being different and more in touch with current pop culture. At this time, sex and violence was taking over Hollywood. This was the era of movies like Dirty Harry and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This disagreement led to another rift between Rovin and the Goodmans. The Comics Code Authority literally freaked when Rovin submitted the first Atlas books for approval. The Brute killed 13-year-old boys, Tiger Man's sister is brutally raped and murdered by a couple of good old boys, and Wolf the Barbarian is cutting guys in half. The CCA rejected everything Rovin submitted. This set Atlas's launch date back months. Rovin began fighting the code, and in some cases he fought them panel by panel. The situation got so bad that the president of the CCA contacted Chip Goodman and told him to fire Rovin. To Chip Goodman's credit, he stuck by his editor. Rovin eventually managed to get his comics past the Comics Code and onto the comics racks, but behind schedule. For every week they failed to get comics out, it cost the Goodmans money. They blamed Rovin for this cost. Rovin was put on a short leash, and Chip Goodman got involved with editorial decisions. Chip demanded final approval on everything. Every day turned into a struggle between Rovin and Goodman over the direction of Atlas. The final blow-up happened over the cover of Wolf the Barbarian number 2. Goodman ordered him to change the cover and walked out of the office. That's when Rovin put a T-square into the wall. Frustrated, stressed, and seeing this opportunity slipping by him, Rovin decided to quit. But in one last act of defiance, Rovin sent Grim Ghost issue number 2 to the printer. Chip had not been shown the cover, and with good reason. The cover looked more like a movie poster for a 1970s exploitation film than a comic book cover. Rovin knew Goodman would not approve. And knowing this, he sent it to the printer anyway and walked out. After Rovin left Atlas, his career was pretty much over. No one would hire him. In addition to being toxic with the Comics Code, the other publishers blamed Atlas for their raid on their talent pools. Atlas had quadrupled the page rate of Marvel and DC. Both companies had to jump up to the Atlas rate just to keep the people they had. Another thing Marvel and DC did to combat Atlas was to give vendors a higher percentage rate. Then, both companies flooded the comic racks with new titles that contained a lot of reprint material. With the vendor getting a higher cut and the addition of these new titles, they squeezed Atlas out of the marketplace. The Atlas books sat in warehouses, with the distributors unwilling to put them out on overcrowded spinner racks. All of this cost DC and Marvel money. 1975 was the first year Marvel Comics did not make a profit. For the next few years, Marvel ran into the red. Atlas and Jeff Rovin took the blame for this. Atlas reorganized after Rovin's departure. Larry Lieber was made solo editor-in-chief. More Marvel people were brought in. The other talent was let go or they walked out on their own. Marvel writer Tony Isabella wrote the 3rd issue of The Grim Ghost. Ernie Colon did the artwork, but it looks rushed. A few panels show the care of the first 2 issues, but for the most part, it looks sloppy. Jeff Rovin is credited as the editor, but he was gone by this point. The Atlas line struggled for a few more months after Rovin's departure, but the Goodmans pulled the plug on the line before a full year of publication could be completed. Only a few of their titles managed to make it to issue 4. The artists and writers limped back to their former employers, but editor Jeff Rovin was forced to find work elsewhere in the publishing world. He went on to write articles for science magazines such as Omni. In the early 1980s, he began writing some of the very first books on video gaming. He continued working on the edges of fandom with such books as the Encyclopedia of Superheroes and the biographies of celebrities like Adam West. He also went on to write novelizations of movies and other intellectual properties. One last thing I would like to mention about Jeff Rovin. When he left the Atlas offices for the last time, he took with him the original art for the cover of Grim Ghost number 2. He had it framed and mounted, and it resides to this day as the centerpiece of his home office.